Dedication. You know, Dr. Chaudhary used to say, you can begin the practice of integral yoga immediately. And the way you do it is you begin with an act of dedication. So whatever you do, you make an offering of whatever that is. And that's the heart of integral yoga. So I was going to, I want to just ask you to get into a very comfortable but alert position. And close your eyes or soften your gaze. And just become aware of your breathing. And feel the breath moving throughout your body. And into your quiet, I'm going to bring these words from Dr. Chaudhary. This is from his first book. His first book was called Prayers of Affirmation. And this is wonderful. May our whole life be an act of self-offering to the divine. Whatever we think and whatever we do, whatever we feel and whatever we desire, from dawn till dusk and from dusk till dawn, may all that be a joyful realization of the divine, expressing itself through us. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. So just take a few more breaths. And when you're ready, open your eyes and be here. Welcome. So I just want to just do one final piece of business, which is introduce Steve Dallman to all of you, if you need an introduction. And then I also want to introduce our dissertation committee. Danielle Delorier, who I guess began working with Steve when Danielle was chair of the East-West Psychology Program, and is now in, what's it called?
Transformative Studies.
Transformative Studies, okay, it's had a number of names, okay. And then Amanda, what's your last name? Gregory, Amanda Gregory, who is from UCSF?
Yes.
Okay, so welcome, Amanda. Thank you. And let me just tell you the procedure. So Steve is going to present his dissertation next, 30 to 45 minute presentation of the dissertation. And then there will be comments and questions from the committee, followed by comments and questions from you, the audience. And then the committee will leave the room and will have a private kind of review and discussion of the dissertation presentation, and then we'll come back and announce our decision. A little ritual of how you become a PhD. Okay, so Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. I know a few of you already told me you're just going to be able to drop by, so don't be uncomfortable if you have to leave. I'll try and keep it entertaining so you want to stay. So, the title of the dissertation is Journeys of Transformation, a narrative inquiry into the spiritual experiences of individuals in recovery from alcoholism and addiction. So what I'm going to do for the next 30 minutes or so is tell you the story of how this came to be, tell you the story of the study. Now, if I had my druthers, I would spend the afternoon telling you about these wonderful people and their amazing stories. But the story for today is the story of the dissertation. So, let's see. So I was a little kid. I was a spiritual nerd little kid. I was like, I wanted to stay in church. Why can't we stay in church every day? I just want to be around nature. I was just always that kind of spiritual nerdy kid. So have a natural draw to spirituality and spiritual experience. Somewhere along the line, I became an alcoholic. Not a surprise, my parents were alcoholics, my grandparents were alcoholics. Most of my family is dead from alcoholism and addiction now. But I found my way into recovery. After, it was in the 80s, so it was alcohol and cocaine. I had my fun, but found my way to AA. So I had that experience as well. So, a little of this and a little of that. So, I graduate with my MA in psychology, clinical psychology for licensure, but something was missing. The stuff that had drawn me into the whole field wasn't all covered in what the BBS wanted covered. And so what did I do? I immediately came here to play with the other little spiritual kids. And it was just what I needed. It's been such a wonderful journey here. So, in the PhD program, you start to focus on what you're going to work on. I knew I wanted to work generally in spiritual experience and transformation and healing, but you have to narrow it, narrow it, and narrow it. So, I start working on that. Let's see. So, start wondering what kind of methodology you're going to use. Start taking some classes. In AA, that's naturally storytelling is the way that the whole program is conveyed. It's very rich in that tradition. So that kind of makes sense. And so there's a connection there between that and AA is very clearly, the whole program is based on the fact that if you have a spiritual experience, it can help you recover. Or it might even be like the key to your recovery and transformation. So it's kind of built in. So starting to narrow this down. And then a key thing in using AA in this process was that as opposed to so many of us, I've had a spiritual experience and now my life is better, or something has changed, or the quality of my life is better. There's a much clearer demarcation from these people, from their reported experience. They say that they've had a spiritual experience from which they have been able to stop drinking when nothing else worked for them. So that it kind of just qualifies it a little bit. So that kind of makes sense to go in there. Then the methodology, the storytelling. I like storytelling, and AA storytelling. So, and you start getting into the underpinnings of this. So you have Jung, who stated that alcoholism is a thirst for wholeness. Basically, that's it. I'm going to be mindful of the time and just kind of frame this whole dissertation, and you guys can ask questions, because I'm realizing that each one of these things I want to get pulled into. But basically, Jung, it's the thirst for wholeness. This was such a rich underpinning and just the core of the experience. Now, it turns out that Jung had part in the history and creation of AA. So I'm delving into this. It's not in the most upfront part of the history, but when you read into it, the way it works, so Bill Wilson is the main founder of AA, for those who don't know. So in the 30s, in the early 30s, a gentleman by the name of Roland Hazard is suffering from alcoholism and can't stop drinking. He has a few bucks, so he's in Switzerland studying with this famous psychologist to see what he can do. And he keeps making a lot of progress in his therapy, but he keeps going back to drinking. Finally, he goes to Jung and says, I keep drinking. And Jung says something to the effect of, Well, in my experience, this is a deadly disease, and there's not much you can do. The only people I know that have really recovered it from it are people that have had a transformative spiritual experience. So Roland Hazard goes off and has a spiritual experience, and stays sober, and he's part of a thing called the Oxford groups, and they were people that got together to study spiritual experience and transformation. A number of alcoholics worked in that group to try and find a solution. So Roland Hazard tells a guy named Ebby about this. Ebby knows Bill Wilson, goes to Bill Wilson's house. Bill Wilson is there chugging whiskey, saying, I gotta stop drinking, I can't. And Ebby tells him about this deal. Well, there's this guy, Carl Jung, and Roland Hazard, and Bill Wilson says, you know, I've had enough of religion, I've had enough of authoritarian things, and I'm not going for that God stuff. Blah, 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 blah. He ends up in the hospital again, desperate. The doctor says, you know, this is pretty much going to kill you. We'll keep drying you out a few more times, but that's kind of the deal. He prays. He says, you know, if you're out there, do something, please. And he has this sort of burning bush type of experience where the room fills up with light, and he never drank again for the rest of his life. These are some of the founding concepts and experiences of AA. So we have this very rich connection there. Then what do you have later in life in the 1960s? Bill Wilson writes a letter to Carl Jung, and Jung writes back. So you have these rich, beautiful letters. Wilson telling the story of the connection of Jung to AA and what AA had expanded to and all the people it was helping. And Jung writing back, saying in a very, very sweet, succinct way his theory of alcoholism, that it's a craving for spirit. It's interesting, in AA you hear the same thing said in that sort of earthy AA language. The way I've often heard it said, something along the lines of, I was trying to fill up a God-sized hole with alcohol and drugs. So in the language of AA, you hear this theory coming out in very experiential street terms almost. So, what else do we have here? So again, the methodology starting to feed all these things, and I'm basically dancing here at CIS, starting to narrow in for a topic, right? So, then we have transpersonal theory, which obviously you have Jung and William James as sort of the godfathers of that. But I wanted to bring it a little more up to date, have some contemporary people addressed in here. So I started looking into that. And so in contemporary transpersonal theory, you have people like Wilbur, sort of a hierarchical, linear type of systems. You have people like Washburn, who are more nonlinear. So you have that issue kind of going on. And then in the history of transpersonal theory, this is just very simplistic, but you have pluralistic and universalism. Pluralism and universalism as a way of looking at or believing in or expressing how spirituality is expressed in the world. Pluralism being more many paths, what Jorge Ferrer would call the many. And universalism being like, well, yeah, there might be many paths, but it's ultimately going to the one same thing. It's all kind of one. And now in the history of transpersonal theory and psychology, it looks to me like it's always been very open in terms of pluralism. It's all been people coming together to discuss these things. But when you get into theory, people really started kind of standing their ground and no, it's pluralism, no, it's universalism, and then these dynamic tensions, and then Wilbur and his quadrants, and into all that comes Jorge Ferrer, who for those who don't know, is a in-house scholar here at CIS, internationally known for his theories and his work. And what he came up with was that basically, what about a relaxed universalism? So pluralism and universalism, many in one. And then what if you, in actually experiencing it, what if that's relaxed? What if it's a matter of dancing with the divine? It has these wonderful phrases in his writing, things like that. Dancing with the ground, co-creating with the mystery. And so it's not as like hard cut. He talks about relaxed universalism, so like there's these paths going many places, but it's like a lake with many different shores. It's very, very poetic, and it kind of speaks to the almost indescribable, non-vocal, non-word part of spiritual experience, and he tries to intellectually get around that. So that's what he comes up with, participatory spirituality. And I went into that a little bit, one for the contemporary part, but because it ends up playing into what happened with this study pretty well. Now, so we're dancing with all this. I got to do a dissertation. How do we focus this? I'm going to study spiritual experience. I'm going to use narrative methodology, and so I'm going to be interviewing some people. But what questions is this going to ask? So I wanted to be careful not to be stuck in like, what is spirituality? Does AA really work or not? Does spiritual experience, does that really change people or not? I didn't want to get into that argument. I just wanted to study what these people's stories would say about their experience and how that would address this quest for spirit to find out what spiritual experience works, how it works. So the research questions ended up, well, these modern day stories, the stories of the people that I interviewed, reflect and support Jung's theory of alcoholism as a thirst for wholeness, as well as the experiences of the founders of AA. Will these kind of match up? And what insights might the stories reveal into the role of personal spiritual experience in transformation and healing? Just as some people here would say, what are the fruits gleaned from this process? So to set up the study, I basically put the word out in AA, put some flyers up. The qualifications for the study were, I believe, I can't remember how many years, it's something like 3 years I think I asked for, of self-reported continuous sobriety and abstinence recovery. And that these people needed to feel as if they had had a spiritual experience that they believe had contributed to their recovery. I just put that simply. It didn't have to be like, this got you sober, that was it. So these wonderful people show up one at a time over a few months. And the question I asked was, now this is the narrative methodology that I particularly use. I was guided very well with Danielle in this when I was putting this all together. So I just sat him down and tell me a story about a spiritual experience you have had that has directly contributed to your recovery. And I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but I was quite pleased and amazed at what came out of these people's mouths. So let's see what we got here. Let me just going to briefly go through these stories, just sort of describe the person. Whoops. Describe the person and say a little bit about their spiritual experience and what it was. And go through the rest of this, and then maybe your questions, and perhaps even the stories are just so rich. Like I said, I wish I could just like tell those stories because they were so rich and so heartwarming. But that's not the story we're telling right here. I'll do a little bit of that, but then maybe I can read you a few quotes while the committee's out discussing, because they've had the privilege of reading these people's stories already. Anyway, so here we have Eric. And Eric identifies as a 33-year-old mixed-race straight male. He says he's just a regular guy. He's been continuously clean and sober 7 years. So doing the math, he got sober in his mid-20s, pretty young, as these things go. His spiritual experience, beautiful story, just like this regular guy. You know, he likes basketball and stuff, but family puts him in rehab, and he's staying clean and sober. And he's working the steps. And he's over here on the 11th step, working the steps kind of classically with a sponsor in the 12-step AA program, kind of like just kind of doing it by rote, and the 11th step prayer that's traditionally used in the AA program is the prayer of St. Francis. Make me instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. And so he's reading this prayer with his sponsor doing his 11th step. And it's just amazing. I'll get emotional with this stuff. But you could just, even when he was telling the story, you could see his heart just opening up. It was just so beautiful. This like normal, everyday, regular guy talking about like, oh, and I said this prayer, and I don't know what happened. I just kind of like felt alive for the first time. And he's like, and then you know what, man? It's like I realized I live in San Francisco. Do you get it? St. Francis, San Francisco. You know, so the whole world was alive to him, and it stuck with him. He reports that transformed his life. So then we have Dawn. She identifies as a 48-year-old Caucasian woman, a survivor and a people person. She's been continuously clean and sober 8 years. So her experience, she was having several problems, including some health issues, and she just prayed for help before going to bed. People say in AA, pray for help, pray for help. She goes to sleep, she has a dream. In that dream, her mother, who had recently died, comes to her and says, you know, honey, I was thinking, when you were a little girl, you really liked to do gymnastics and hula hoop. Maybe you should do something like that. She kind of poo-poos the dream, but the next day she ends up serendipitously into a Qigong class. That Qigong class ends up transforming her life. She relates to it. It changes her health. It gives her another community outside of AA to relate to, and she's continued that practice, and she reported that it really, really helped her. Then we have Ray. Ray is a 53-year-old Caucasian straight man, calls himself the sweetest, kindest, hard-ass ex-con you'll ever meet. He's been continuously clean and sober for 16 years. Now this guy sits down and he's just kind of quiet for a minute. He says, you know, I'm going to tell you about this little voice. And he calls it a quiet inner voice. And that quiet inner voice got him into recovery. He's waiting in the line outside of a church for free food. And that's the first time he heard the voice, and the voice guided him to go in there and ask for help. And that voice guided him in early recovery, and it still guides him today. So we're starting to get an idea of like, whoa, these are all really different and rich stories. Teresa is a 28-year-old Latina, describes herself as a dancer, a musician, a poet, and an Aztec princess. Is a very, very lively young woman. She's been clean and sober for 8 years continuously. Her story, it's kind of hard to even tell it because it almost has to be in her words, but I think that'll be the one that I read. Because it's so kind of unique and rich and sort of outside the box. Let's see here. So Teresa had already been in recovery a while. This is of note because she's one of those people that didn't like the God stuff, didn't relate to God, and was kind of using her AA group of peers, people her age and stuff, as her higher power in order to work the steps, which is kind of how that program works. So she's having trouble. She's been sober for a while. She's walking down the street here in the Mission, and I'll say it in her words. She said, my head was all twisted up with some relationship issues and some work issues, and for the first time in a long time I was thinking that maybe I should get loaded. I was just walking down the street when a car drove by with the windows down and music blaring. Right as the car passed me, the words of the song were, Maria, you've got to see her. Go insane and out of your mind. Somehow that snapped me out of my self-absorbed mind state, and I just started to grin and laugh at myself. They used to call me Maria when I was a kid because my grandmother's name was Teresa. You know, sometimes in the Latina community, they move the names around like that. It's traditional. And she felt like the song was talking about me. Anyway, at the same time, same exact moment, some clouds parted and sunlight came beaming down on me. I don't know how to describe what happened then. It is as if suddenly I was really present for the first time. I mean, it sounds silly, It's just an old pop song by Blondie, for Christ's sake. It's not the voice of God. But something in me changed in that moment. Then she goes on to talk about skipping down the street and checking her sponsor to see if she's nuts. But that transformation has stayed with her now for a couple of years. She ended up starting a dance in a theater company and starting a pop rock band, and it's given her a sense of self, but a connection to the mystery. So, Teresa. So Jean is a 48-year-old African-American gay male, describes himself as a hardworking, sober, spiritual person having a human experience. He's been continuously clean and sober for 16 years. Now Gene, so he sits down and I ask him the question, and he starts telling me about his trip to Puerto Vallarta. And I'm thinking, oh man, I gotta get some burning bush stuff out of this. You know, and so in the process, this will help me tell you about the actual process of these interviews. So you tape the interview, you transcribe it, and then while you're transcribing it, of course, you're revisiting that interview. And with my typing skills, it took a long time to transcribe these things. And then you read the transcription. I actually listened to the things over and transcribed it. And then you sort of pare that down into sort of a chronological story. I use sort of in vignette format, like we use in clinical psychology, to just sort of put this together. But so there I am, and I'm thinking, what's the spirituality in like going to the beach and stuff? Though his language had spirituality in it, but then I really got the full value of his spiritual experience when I was transcribing it. That's why the methodology is so important in these types of research things, I think. Because what his spiritual experience was that he's on the plane for his first solo sober trip, and he starts to get kind of freaked out and feel like drinking for the first time in years. I'm all alone. What the hell was I thinking going to this strange place? And then as soon as he gets there, all these synchronistic things keep happening. He starts doing spiritual practices, and as soon as he gets there, the neighbor in the resort condo right next to him is in AA, tells him where the AA meetings are there in Puerto Vallarta, and all these things that he just talks about being in the moment and feeling cared for and having this, getting connected and doing these spiritual practices, and it's quite a great story. Then we have Jenny. Jenny's a 42-year-old Caucasian straight woman, describes herself as creative, real, and usually happy. She's been continuously clean and sober 18 years. Now, Jenny had gotten sober in 12 steps, AA and NA, but she hadn't found a spirituality that worked for her. And so she was trying different things, and she ended up going into a church where she felt really at home. There was a great choir, and she's feeling loved, and she felt connected to her higher power. She said, I felt God's love in that place. And so she started participating in that community. As part of participating in that community, she ends up in a recovery circle, they called it, but a support group of women. And as she stays clean and sober, she starts recovering these thoughts, these memories of childhood sexual abuse. So because of that container and in that church and feeling supported, then she was able to find professional treatment for her childhood issues and keep doing her recovery, and that's her story. Now it's funny when you read the story, or when I was transcribing it, it's like this really heavy, dark, traumatic stuff that she had somaticized. But when you're sitting with her, she is just full of life and full of spirit. And then I started working with a therapist, and that was so great. And you know, the vivaciousness and spirit of these people is just wonderful. I had such a good time doing this. So then there's John. John is a 53-year-old Caucasian man, calls himself a peaceful cosmic jokester with a green thumb. He's been continuously clean and sober for 11 years. His spiritual experience is Zen Buddhism. So, he tells a story of getting into AA as sort of a punk rocker, not really relating, kind of being on the fringes. Never liked authority, never liked rules, kind of hangs out with the Dharma punk community somewhat, if anybody knows who that is. That's sort of a meditative fringe community in 12-step world. And so he's kind of dealing with all these things. He happens upon a book, happens to open a book one day, very just serendipity. You know, you're looking for one thing and something else shows up. And he reads this line by an old Japanese Zen master, and he relates to it. And so I think, well, I better check out this Zen stuff, right? So he goes to a Zen center, ends up becoming part of that community, and today, for several years now, he's been a Zen monk and gardens in their garden. But his interview was, all of these were different, but he in particular, when I was sitting there with it, and he was telling me this, I thought, this is sort of a didactic on Zen. Now, where's my burning bush again, right? But then it ends up being this really great story of connecting his spiritual experience to a spiritual tradition, totally outside of the experience of the originators of AA, but still a spiritual experience of transforming his life. And talking a lot about how Zen works that way for him. Great story. Then finally there's Kate. Now Kate IDs as a 36-year-old Caucasian woman, a sober yogi mom with a weakness for chocolate. She's been clean and sober continuously for 6 years. So she originally got sober because she was pregnant. So she managed to stay sober for 9 months with the pregnancy. And then she started drinking again after she has the kid. So the kid's like 4 or 5, I guess, whatever age you're going off to kindergarten for the first time. She's too hungover to take the kid to his first day of school. And she talks about love being so transformative in this process. So she's looking out the window, watching the little kid, and her mom and her mother go to take the kid to his first day of school. And she goes to wash dishes, and she realizes that as a kid, she and her mother, that was almost like a meditative time. She always felt safe doing dishes with her mother, and that's where she got her mother's wisdom. And so she's doing the dishes, and she just breaks down and starts crying, and that was her moment of surrender. That's when she said, that's it. Because of her love for her son and her experience of her own parental love, and just there she was doing the dishes. She got present, and that was it. She got herself into recovery, and she's been clean and sober ever since. Another beautiful story. It's interesting because when she was doing the interview, she starts talking about yoga and how great that's been, 12 steps being really helpful, how they loved me till I could love myself, is the way she put it. But then she realized that washing the dishes was the core thing, and she said something to the effect of, I have AA, and I'm a yogi, and I do chanting, and I do all these wonderful things. I tell you a story about washing the damn dishes. But that was the richness of it, the reality of it. So, where are we here? So, collect all these stories. I sit with them. I do the transcribing. I do the vignettes. And then, as part of this process, I'm all the time to be looking for themes. What are some themes that are, I specifically want ones that related to at least 5 of these stories. So some of these themes, they'll actually say the actual words. Other ones, they'll just, the story will just sort of ooze that or talk about it in different ways. So this is, for this process, when we go back to trying to answer these questions, from doing this dance, look at the journeys. So you have this wonderful, rich stuff, but the stories don't seem to connect. How does it connect to stuff like this and this? This is again where the methodology came in, so it just worked as it's supposed to work. So I started going through these things, and what I came up with was the journey, the path, the motion, moving forward. but mostly it's the journey, the path. Wholeness and fulfillment. How wonderful that that would come up considering Jung's theory, but the sense of change and wholeness and fulfillment. So it wasn't always just a story of like I couldn't stop drinking and I started drinking, though most people kind of told their get sober stories in the process. But there was something that God-sized hole seemed to get filled by the spiritual experience. That was the transformative part. Body and breath. Body, I see some Thematic students over there, they'll like this part. So that got expressed a lot in a number of different ways. Being in the present moment, the here and now. Community. AA as community, the community of different types, being around them and supporting them, being in relation to others. Spiritual practice or practices and activity. So this is everything from going to AA meetings, to meditation, to prayer, to going to church, to doing Qigong, to listening to Blondie, whatever works for you, that's where that stuff came in. Synchronicity and serendipity. So these both came up in, I think, almost all the stories. That sort of happy accident, sometimes these are referred to. And then from my spiritual experience, my personal favorite, love. And that came up an awful lot. And it's talked about both in the words and in the experience and the expression. And like I said, Kate had the line where AA loved me till I could love myself. That was a beautiful line. But it came in all these different ways. I found some good passages by Jung where he talks about love and connecting love, and talk about spiritual love and how it's really hard to define, but that this is all connected to the potential for individuation and transformation. And then finally the transformation. So hence the title. So it's really doing pretty good. So we get all this stuff, and now we have to go back to these questions. In the dissertation process, I got so into these stories, and I'd be reading one, it's like, oh, look, here's a book on Zen and the 12 steps, and then I would be reading that and trying to, and then here's this and here's that. And then, gratefully, I found out that Brendan wasn't going to be doing this department for that much longer, and it helped get me going on this. So I thought, you know what? Time to narrow this down and do a dissertation here. So, but that's what this whole process from the very, very beginning of walking in the doors of CIS, for those of you who are PhD students, it's narrowing it down to do this project. From here, I have all this wealth of stuff that I'm going to be doing other things with. Anyway, so, question number 1. Will these modern day stories reflect and support Jung's theory of alcoholism as a thirst for wholeness, and as well as the experiences of the founders of AA? So, we have all these things just basically feed right into that. The main points I'd like to make about that. Oh, the letters. So here's the letters. So I do these interviews, transcribe them, come up with all this rich narrative material, come up with these themes. Well, isn't it sweet? I have these letters, which are narrative documents between these founders that helped create this whole paradigm and talk about spirituality and transformation and recovery. So I looked at those letters and I applied the same thematic analysis principles to them. And lo and behold, what did we get? We got, just in those short letters, a lot of this, and particularly the wholeness and fulfillment. But I pretty much concluded, conclusively, I believe, that the answer to number 1 is yes, definitely. But now number 2, now that's a big, broader, richer thing. And again, but I had a tendency to want to like go here and there, but let's keep it focused here. So here's what I ended up with. Spiritual experiences are personal, highly varied, and often unique. Now that seems like a simplistic kind of thing, especially here at CIS. Well, yeah, But I think it's foundationally an important statement to make, an important thing to notice, especially when you're talking about connecting this people from AA, from a tradition that a lot of people that aren't in AA or people that start AA and don't like it, see it as cult-like, that this is how this works a certain way. Particularly the language is very, particularly in AA even more than the other 12-step programs, is very white man Christian language, it's often called. Anyway, so that's number one. Number two, similarities and continuity can be found between diverse spiritual experiences by way of thematic analysis. As I just said, like I used in the letters, and all these things from 80 years apart, almost word for word, the same types of things, this filling up, the experiences, the thematic analysis just brought it down to denominators that made it clear that there is continuity of experience with these people. Number three, spiritual experiences occur in context as part of a process. Now this is, again, just feeding into the same thing. There's something about, it's not just like la 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 bing. All the stories has to do sort of dancing around. It reminded me of what Jorge would write about co-creating, dancing with the mystery, dancing with the divine. And so that feeds into this other finding, which says that spiritual experiences can be viewed as resulting from a synergistic partnership between an individual and a higher power. In other words, the individual takes some action, and divinity, higher power, spirituality, something takes an action to help them. And that what happens is something that seems to be more than that person could have done just on their own or had to that point, and something more than their higher power had been seeming to do up until that point. So they dance together, they co-create. And synergistically, something by both of them taking action, something seems to happen. And transformation and healing that result from spiritual experience may not necessarily be restricted to recovery from alcoholism and addiction. So, in the question I asked again, tell me a story about a spiritual experience you've had that has directly contributed to your recovery. I would not have been surprised to get like, well, I was sitting at home and I was not really feeling like going to an AA meeting, and then a friend called and I didn't expect them to call, and so this was kind of like the spiritual thing, so I went to a meeting. Something a little more mild, but all these stories just poured out all this richness, and it was about transformation of their whole selves. Not one of them told a story that simply was about them staying clean and sober. It all had all this other stuff involved. So I see the point. And finally, to bring it back to contemporary theory again, spiritual experiences as expressed in this study in the 12-step community are examples of participatory spirituality. So I feel pretty firm in making this claim because while here at CIS I worked with Jorge and pretty much got him to agree to this concept. Actually he was very supportive of it and really enjoyed the work we did together on it. So, but apart from that, so here we have this theory, and if you read it, frankly, when I read some of that stuff, I can't quite get it all. You know, it's like maybe read it 2 or 3 times, and what is he talking about it, and read the review of the book to kind of see what somebody else maybe figured out what he's talking about. But in the stuff like I told you, in the co-creation of the mystery, the relaxed spiritual universalism, like it's all kind of one thing. But many paths, the one and the many. I think it's pretty clear that is what's happening with these people, what's happening in Bill Wilson's experience. So you have the synergy, that's the co-creating. It keeps coming up in all these different ways. So that's pretty much the findings. And another thing I want to say, the last few minutes here, is that I guess the earthiness of AA, like I've kind of touched on in some of these quotes and stuff. And then we're here at CIS. I'm doing this academic program, and then that ivory tower thing, and Ken Wilber and his quadrants, and Jorge and intellectual discussions, and here's this stuff being lived in the most gritty, transformative, real, genuine, growing, lively ways. So what this did for me, and what I want to express, is that when you're co-creating with the mystery, you can do it intellectually, and you can do it in theory, and you can do it on the streets in the AA program, and it's all inspiring, and it's all useful, and you just gotta, here we are right now, kind of feeling a little something from all this spiritual discussion and the wonderful beginning we had to this. And so, you just gotta all remember this and go out and dance, go out and find something that works for us and keep on it. I promise you it will transform you. Now that thing could be going to a beautiful church, it can be meditating, it can be listening to Blondie music like I do often, but I just want to encourage everybody to take all of themselves and expand and transform. Thank you. I think it's questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. That was very inspiring. You're very gifted at presenting ideas that come alive. I think it's one of the gifts that you have. I think you just demonstrated to us how you can make theory alive. So I think your verbal presentation was really a reflection of the written presentation that many of you have not seen. But your written presentation was also very clear. You have a way of bringing your audience in, relating to your audience. You do it in your writing and you do it in your speaking. So I want to just comment on that. I also, it's clear, and I think it's clear to the committee too, that one of the high points of this dissertation is in fact the stories of your 8 co-researchers. They're very powerful, and I do think it's important that you publish this study with a focus on the storytelling itself. I think it's totally worth it. One of the things that it does is it actually expands the idea of what AA is about. I think there are a lot of people that feel that AA really is white man Protestant spirituality, basically. And what your research is showing is that it's much broader in the way it's lived, that individuals relate to it from a wide spectrum of experiences, and I think that's a very important contribution. I would highlight that. We are going to have another dissertation, I don't know, in the next year or so, attacking AA for narrowness. So I think this conversation that you're starting about where AA is and what it does is an important conversation. I think there's something important to add to it. Something else that struck me about your view of AA is 2 things. One is how important the community is in AA. For example, you quote one of your co-researchers as, "They loved me until I could love myself." That is a very powerful feeling. Community experience, that comes out of the community. And another, I think you said this in your dissertation, that there are people in AA for whom the community is the higher power. That's important to see, that the community is the higher power, because we get a disembodied idea of higher power. It's up in the sky somewhere, it's disembodied, and I think your co-researchers really brought the higher power into their daily life, experienced it in very concrete and embodied ways. let's see, there's, I think also the thing that struck me that I think you're really bringing to the discussion of AA is, you say in your dissertation that it is the storytelling itself that is critical to AA, and I think maybe that needs to be emphasized. You are dealing with people who are natural storytellers, and they are in a community that invites story every day, right? People are asked to tell their story. So that narrative quality, that storytelling quality is essential to the AA experience, I think. And I think it's implicit in your presentation, but when you publish, you might want to make that more explicit. The narrative quality of the... So let's see. I also really appreciated, you just made this point, that we were talking here about lasting change. We're not just talking about kind of temporary conversion experiences that lead to stopping of drinking or stopping destructive behaviors. It's much broader than just stopping destructive behaviors. It's a life, it sounds like it's affecting how one lives one's life. So, I also was moved by how moved you are by this experience, or just the way you were sharing. And I noticed one final thing I wanted to just mention to you. So beyond your formal findings, and by the way, I hope you appreciate, many of you I think are dissertation students, and I hope you appreciate the way that Stever actually took you inside the dissertation writing process. He was doing that. I hope you were getting it. He's telling you how this works from the inside. And I think often I think many of you come to dissertation defenses hoping that you'll get some insight about how the process works, but not everyone does it. But you did it today very clearly, that you really brought people into the process, how you do a dissertation. So. But beyond the formal findings of the study, you mentioned courage, beauty, strength, and grace in the lives of these 8 amazing people. But I think that says something about your ability to see these qualities. And I want to just say to the group, you don't get stories like this unless you create an environment where someone feels that they can talk deeply about what's most important. So the collaborative, participatory process is embedded in the method. And I think you do this method particularly well because you bring that quality of openness, and that you see the potential here, and that's why people are willing to say what they have to say. So my comments have been mostly comments rather than asking you to define something or clarify something, but I wonder if you want to just respond to what I am raising, some of these issues I'm just raising with you.
Yeah, well, then, for one thing, to go back to the process, the fact that I'm a clinical therapist,
Yeah.
I think, and the way I kind of know how to do that, and that field sort of matches my personality, again, really fed well to what you so kindly commented on my ability to help these people tell their stories. But again, for you guys, the one of the comments in one of the stories, I think it was Teresa, she needed to find a higher power to do the steps, and they're talking about it. And somebody in one of her groups said it could be the community, and their thing was, it could be this group of drunks, G-O-D, get it? God. That's what she said to me, get it? G-O-D, group of drunks, God. But really just something, it's a power greater than herself. It's those 20 people that she met with once a week to help work on her recovery. And obviously it expanded quite for her, quite away from that, but it was plenty, it's what she needed.
So I was wondering, you talking about well, you were emphasizing things that were kind of inspiring with regard to AA and spiritual experiences, and one of the criticisms of AA is some of the critical language, so things like character flaws. And then I was thinking about how you might incorporate some of your findings into more evidence-based treatments like CBT, which have also kind of been critiqued for overly focusing on symptoms rather than people's strengths. So if you were kind of, contributing to a treatment that was mainly evidence-based like CBT, how would you incorporate some of your findings?
So that's I kind of touched on it, but just very lightly. I treaded lightly on the clinical implications part of this. I got a little cheeky in there, but generally speaking, I would say if somebody has an issue like alcoholism, get as much help from as many directions as you can. But when I was doing the background research, there was a study done at the University of Texas at Austin, and it was actually a meta-study. And what they found were all these different measurements of spirituality. But in doing this meta-study with all the background and stuff in there, what they found is that, yes, spirituality, there's evidence that spiritual experience can help people in their recovery from alcoholism and addiction, but there's also evidence-based that CBT can. And I guess the other answer to your question is that there's layers of things, and there's layers. There's what is clinically called what is it called? Multiple problems. Anyway, so you have alcoholism on the first layer, and then you might have bipolar and all sorts of other experiences. Dual diagnosis is what we usually call it. But so these things are in order to diagnose and work on them, they're separated, but they're not separate. So if you just lean only on spiritual experience, then you get the possibility of what we call spiritual bypassing, and kind of stay high on the spiritual experience, and the other stuff that perhaps is what you were drinking to medicate to begin with is going to come up and kick you in the butt. All that given, I was going to say one more thing about that. I don't think there's another piece to that.
How do you plan to incorporate your findings into the treatment that you're going to do at Liberation Institute?
Very good, thank you. So in the way I work with clients and the way I'm encouraging other people to work, and again, within my clinical implications of this, regardless of who you are trying to help somebody, especially from within the medical or helping model, just to hold that this is someone's experience. It doesn't have to be your experience, but how could you nurture this? How can you see this in them? At the Liberation Institute, we do a positive strengths assessment, and I literally assess for what is this person's ability to access something greater than themselves. They might have a spiritual practice, they might love basketball, they might be a musician, anything, especially when we deal so often with these continuums of depression, anxiety, and addiction. Just that positive assessment. And then if any of us as clinicians, whether we like Jung or not, or like AA or not, just hold that this is something that can transform people, as these people's experience has been. We can certainly help people with that, support them with that, while holding our own truths and all our training and all the other possibilities that we might have for these people.
I really enjoyed reading all the stories, and in honor of Teresa's higher power, I just got some blind tickets.
Oh, really? Oh, excellent.
Well, congratulations. A good dissertation is a completed dissertation. And so that's the final and kind of giving quality of the dissertation. But in your case, I actually, as Brendan said, particularly appreciated the way that you held the story of the participants. And as a researcher, you kind of like have to have a certain kind of skill there so that you don't break it down so much analytically that you kind of leave the spirit out. And then it seems like you've done a good analysis, but the analysis doesn't quite totally reflect what the person is going through in the complexity of the phenomenon. And I think the beauty of where you ended up around the themes is kind of like that kind of sweet place, sweet spot that kind of speaks to the commonality between them in a way that brings it up, kind of brings to the foreground these dimension that speaks to the spiritual transformation. So that is kind of like the beauty of the research. Now I do have a question for you that you didn't address the dissertation. So this is more like a defense type question.
Oh, good.
Just because I'm French and I like the defense part and a good debate or whatever. And the question came to me as you were doing your presentation right now. Because if you think of AA as a form of intervention, on the one hand, and then you think of Jung and Jungian analysis as another form of intervention. When I think of them almost as two very distinct way of kind of coming to the process of transformation. And here you make a link to them in a way, but they're very, very different. And the fact that Jung was behind AA is kind of an interesting part in that story. So here I was wondering if you were to describe, first of all, and the reason why I'm asking you this is because your dissertation is situated there, between AA, Jung, and the transpersonal psychology. Although I want to focus more on AA and Jung. So if you were to think of the way that those two approach or interventions kind of work through transformation, how would you see that your dissertation speaks to their differences, AA and Jung?
The differences.
Yeah.
I was already with the similarities.
Yeah. But
so the differences obviously would be that, again, the approach, one's an intervention, how Jung worked, the whole perspectives. But I would think of it more as a difference of, let's look at how AA developed. And it was like, a spiritual experience, but that could be so many things to so many different people. But how are we going to make up something that can help people have some sort of spiritual experience to where they don't have to drink again? So they come up with these steps. Anybody can do them and basically manufacture a spiritual experience. So that's what I was thinking in terms of the similarity. Jung, with this concept of individuation and what is the broad path of, what is the purpose of human existence, and what is the broad path of that of human experience, and the individuation path, and trying to move people along, support people in dreaming their lives and having spiritual growth. So the difference being, the main difference, to answer your question, would be this is specifically focused on something that you will not get to finish your individuation process because this is either going to stunt your growth or kill you. So the whole thing in AA is focused on getting you over that one hump. And then if you like that program, you can continue to work these steps as many people do, and continue to use it as what they call program for life. But many people in AA, or use AA just for the sober part, and go on to co-create with the mystery, which I think is what, if Jung were here now, would kind of, use it as a tool or not use it as a tool. But again, it's the main difference. It's focused on this one thing, getting over the addiction. Thought.
Could I?
Yeah, sure.
I want to say something as a Jungian-oriented psychotherapist who has worked with people who are in the throes of addictive behavior. I think the first difference is that Jung admitted that his therapy was ineffective in treating addiction. So the first difference is Jungian therapy doesn't work for addiction. I mean, that's Jung saying that. I can't. It's rare. I don't know any place in Jung's writings where he says, I couldn't help. Well, actually, he does say in other places that he can't help somebody, but he's very specific about alcohol. So, as someone who has worked with people who either had acknowledged addictions or unacknowledged addictions, I mean, I've had clients, doing psychotherapy, doing very well in psychotherapy, and outside of the psychotherapy, they are drinking themselves to death. But they're not reporting it. And I have to figure out eventually, and actually do say this, I've had a number of clients where I've said to them, I can't continue to work with you unless you get into a program. And it doesn't have to be AA, but it needs to be a program that specifically addresses the addictive behavior. The other thing I would say is that within AA, the AA model itself, you should correct me on this, but my sense is that someone outside the AA world who's a psychotherapist, that for many, many years, AA was against psychotherapy. Is that right?
Actually, no.
Oh, no?
It's a concept that a lot of the non-AA world has, and people even in AA, it's like medication, psychotherapists, but it's actually in there. They call it outside help, and they talk about doing it. And they even in the basic literature written in the 30s, they even say you can, like the ninth step, where the fifth step, where you tell all the bad things you've done to someone that you trust. They suggest it could be a sponsor, it could be a priest, or it could be a therapist.
Okay.
So it is. It's
So
in
maybe
there.
that's just
But in the community, there's a resistance, and there's a thing. Use the steps in your higher power. That's going to do it. Come on, knuckle up, man. But in the actual real literature, it's in.
Many spiritual traditions actually work that way. Meditate more, or you're depressed, meditate more.
Yeah.
You're having, just sit on your cushion for a longer period of time. So many spiritual traditions, this is where psychology and spirituality, I think, have something important to say to each other. But the other thing I did find is once someone is committed to working with their addiction in a specific conscious way, then like a Jungian psychotherapy or a blood-based psychotherapy can be very effective in that larger process of individuation. But I do think, and it's a really good point, but I do think that there are real differences that probably need to be.
Well, I mean, I'm just surfacing it here in terms of this conversation. I find it fascinating that Jung would be the one of the originator of AA by acknowledging a mistake, or not a mistake, a limit of his own therapeutic intervention, and then almost as if spirit had to kind of find another way. One difference that I see is, I think around year 15 there, around community, individual therapy is kind of intersubjective, but really one-on-one. Was AA,
That's right.
you call in the community and the higher power, right?
Yeah.
So that's a difference too. And then what you say, the regimental dimension of it, that kind of leaves the therapeutic, transference and all of these things, they're not there. And you concentrate on the power of the story, which then that's common in both.
Yeah.
The story, the power of the story, the power of the way people are going through the journey, wholeness, fulfillment, that's all kind of common. But community, that's very different. And
Well, one thing just to point out in this dialogue that's interesting to what you just said is when you carefully read the letter that Jung wrote back to Wilson, he's basically saying, yeah, I knew this was the only way, and there are some things that I would not say to this guy. He's basically saying, I tried in the therapeutic relationship to tell him to go out and get this spiritual experience, to try therapeutically to motivate him to do that because I knew that's all what he needed. So, in that sense.
And so, therefore, the value of the dissertation and in here, and that's my second question to you, is to kind of create a container for this story to be there, so that when people read them, they can relate to it. And that's the beauty of the AA program and the storytelling process. Now, my second question to you is, what do you add to the big book? What does this research add to the big book? Now that you know, number one is, you said, oh yes. But what, to someone who says, okay, well, the big book is there and it has stories inside and all that, what does your research kind of add to it?
Well, that's kind of a tricky story because this is like sanctified AA literature, right? In the history of AA, this book has been redone 3 times. The first pages remain exactly the same, but they add different stories to try and make it more contemporary. So I would say, in that sense, that's one of the answers. But the other answer is that and I even didn't do it a lot in my work, kind of like, well, here's a short chapter on what criticisms of AA, right? Just to sort of technically balance it out. But that would be, and they try and do that in the language in here. It's kind of like, they don't tell you to do anything. This is our experience and our suggestions. But still, it's kind of, this is the way it is. So I would say that what this adds from these people's personal stories is that this works, this is really helpful, take what you can, leave the rest, but go out and do it. Basically, the thing. So you aren't going to read that in the AA literature, but you're going to hear it in some meetings when some of these people share.
And I'm assuming that, if you were to say about this, do you think the theme and the finding kind of adds to it?
Oh yeah.
Okay. I just want you to
Oh,
claim this for yourself here.
Oh, that would be sweet to like do a. And I even was at a point where I thought, should I take some of these stories, the stories in the book, other stories in the book, as narrative material? And I thought, no, I gotta get this thing done. But just to even use this narrative methodology on those stories, would be great.
So, Amanda, are you finished?
Yeah.
I just want to ask you, do you want to add anything to this conversation about psychotherapy and spiritual practice? Because you've been implying some things about it.
Well, I mean, I was just thinking about with regard to evidence-based treatments, they're pretty structured. From your presentation, obviously the storytelling and the spirituality with regard to transformation was really important, and it doesn't seem like in a lot of structured treatments there's a lot of place for that. So that was sort of my question to you before was, how would you incorporate that, or do you think it would be a good idea to incorporate that?
That would be interesting. And so again, in that study, I was surprised at how many, 60-something different measurements in the medical psychology world of spiritual experience. So I think that's sort of the cutting edge now is what you're talking about. How do we, if that's these people's experiences, then that should be part of the evidence. That should be part of the base. And if we're trying to do that, now how to fully integrate it into how to build an insurance company, because someone is skipping down the street now after seeing you a few weeks and you played Blondie's song. I'm not sure how to do that, but I think that's the edge there. But I'd like to think that's where we're going. We have an institute, we can do it there.
It sounds like what you're planning on doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the other way it might be to say, is there a therapeutic value of asking your dissertation question to clients?
Ooh. And
So that could be an
bring-
intervention. Tell me
Yeah.
a story about a spiritual experience.
Yeah.
That's an intervention.
Yeah, and
It could be actually coded in a book, in a treatment.
Are you interns paying attention? Some of our interns are. But yeah, and even like and then make client centered. Might say, you know, take spiritual out with some clients or but that that's sort of like
Yeah.
look, we just contributed to narrative therapy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of.
And then just looking, you know, at the efficacy and add a question is which interventions were the most important to you? And that could be one of the options, and then you could make an argument.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
I didn't know we were going to birth the whole thing. That's excellent.
And in a way, that storytelling in itself can be therapeutic. If there's not a question, there won't be an action, you know, so.
Cool.
So, you know, you have some choices about how you want, this dissertation needs to get out. You know, the only people that read dissertations are doctoral students. So we need to get it out, and I think it could be an article looking at the clinical implications and maybe focused more specifically and kind of in the way that Amanda is suggesting. So then that becomes an article for the clinical community. I do think there's also a book here about stories that would reach a wider public. And then there may be something, a presentation or an article to the AA community itself. So I know today is about finishing their dissertation. And I've had dissertation students tell me, do not talk to me about publishing anything. I want to break, I just want to get the dissertation done. But I just want to mention that I do think there's real potential here to bringing this information to a wider public, that's all.
Thanks. Yeah, this process, just because of the richness of the topic and these stories, I got sick of APA perhaps, but I didn't get sick of this process. I'm ready to let it keep
Okay.
moving, just like I'm so excited about what we just co-created here. I mean, it's brilliant.
Well, how about opening it up to the larger community here?
Questions? You can ask anything, except for how I picked out my answer.
Where'd you get your pants? No, great dissertation. It was good. I'm curious about, so it seems like I'm making a guess here, because I don't know what addictions Young had and which ones he might have been in touch with or not, but it seems like the commonality, and I'm curious if this came out in the stories, is that it's a peer experience that actually helps people stop their addiction, because other people with addictions, talking to people, trying to recover. And so maybe one reason why Young felt his methodology didn't work is because he didn't openly talk about, he was more of a blank slate or more not as transparent about his own issues. And so therefore there wasn't that connection of relating experience. So I don't know. And it's like, so was there always a peer spark connected to the spiritual experiences and the stories that you in your research people? And do you feel that a therapist who is completely transparent about being an addict with their client one-on-one could also create this situation outside of a community like AA?
Well, I think I caution against the saying that the therapist creates the situation. Nurture it, plant it, water it. But in these stories themselves, I think that community and the like feeling heard, recognizing your own story, something you could relate to, came up, but it wasn't the core thing. These were all the core experiences they talked about were that relationship with the higher power of some sort, that dance, that kind of experience. But It's interesting because it kind of touches on what Danielle said, because then, what if Jung has been around when we started doing group therapy? He said, well, what you need is to see me once a week and be in this group with these other people with that problem. Have that be reflected there. So I think it's community. And you hear stories from, just sort of slightly off topic, but you hear stories from, as a therapist, of people who found a community of like-minded people and got sober that way outside of AA.
Thanks, Steve. I'm just curious, I'm really sort of focusing on alcoholism as a thirst for wholeness. And I'm wondering if in the process of talking to these folks, whether you personally would say addictive behaviors as a thirst for wholeness, or do you feel like it's specific to alcoholism?
Oh no, I think it's a thirst for wholeness. My personal opinion is that it's inherent to the human nature, to every human process.
But I mean, is it about alcoholism, or is it about addictive behaviors? That's what I'm
Addictive
saying.
behaviors.
So any addictive behavior.
I think so. But though, you can break it down to the nature and nurture side, and then alcohol, maybe you're trying to fill the hole, but there's a part where clinically you become addicted to that chemical, and it becomes something else as well, of course. It's not like you can try and fill up that God-sized hole, but you're still going to be jonesing for heroin if you're physically addicted to it until you get off. That kind of.
Yeah, just because I'm aware of it and sort of out there. I mean, there are a lot of, I guess there's even controversy about all the things that get called addictions. And I'm just wondering if from your point of view, this approach, or the whole question of spirituality, would be key to really anything that intervenes as a problem in a person's life, I mean, in that kind of a way.
What's interesting is that there's, that last time I looked, when I was working on this, 30-something different types of 12-step programs, everything from overeating and then some that start to sound even a little silly. But I remember when I got sober, and I'd be telling them, oh, I heard this thing in AA, and I'd tell them one of the cute sayings that are just so rich and earthy, and people were starting to say, I wish I was alcoholic. That sounds like you're getting a lot out of that. So I said, well, you can go to Al-Anon, whatever. There's so many different programs.
I was kind of to go on what you were saying. This is not my question, but a way to bring it into the therapy room could be an expressive arts therapist using drama therapy to tell these stories. And it's not just about having witness with a group, but you're one-on-one, you could do that one-on-one and have them kind of act it out and all these words, yeah. I came in a little late, but did you talk about your own spiritual experience? Did you answer this question in your dissertation, or did you keep it separate?
I kept it separate. It was a question that you had to decide, but I decided just to qualify it briefly because of my bias. As a clear bias. This is my experience, this is my interest in the process, and this is also my experience to make it clear that I do have a clinical bias. But I decided early on that I was more interested in other people's stories. I know mine. I've told a lot of times. Other people might find it interesting. And as I continue to do this work, I think there'll come a time to tell my story. But I could, as a little spiritual nerdy kid who's about to be 60 and is still a spiritual nerdy kid, you could ask me that question 100 times, and I would be glad to keep giving you different answers. What's the timeline?
We have about 4 more minutes for questions if people want.
Does anybody have a 4-minute question?
I hope this isn't too specific, but I cannot get this client out of my head. He goes to AA. He's been sober from alcohol and drugs for 5 years, and yet he's still struggling with sex addiction, even though he's working, and now he's working the SLAA program too. But I find myself wondering, he's so ingrained in the AA program and it's working, why that learning, the knowledge, the inner knowing hasn't transferred for him yet. And I know, now that I finished the question, I'm like, that is probably too specific. But did you shared that the 8 stories here, but did you talk to other folks that maybe had a similar thing? Did you any insights that you might be able to share?
Well, nothing that I can think of offhand that directly came out of this study. I don't remember anybody talking about that specifically, but we have people like Dawn and Jenny, specifically Dawn and Jenny who come to mind, that they had this experience of AA, actually kind of all of it came up in a lot of these, have experience of AA helping to get them clean and sober, and that's working, but then another problem came up, and they needed to have this another spiritual experience or move along on their journey to bring something else in. For which was at Dawn, it was a qigong. So she was having other issues come up. So it does come up. So it's kind of like, I don't know, it's hard when you have something working so well for someone, and they believe that this stuff will keep working, and it will, but comes a point, like in my own recovery, where we always talked about, like, you got to switch gears, you got to keep it fresh, they say there sometimes, but be willing to try other things. Obviously, if they're seeing a therapist, that's really, they're trying outside help and stuff. So that's the deep rooted, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes in the AA tradition, if you're like the stuff about, I stopped drinking, and that seemed so dramatic and seemed really difficult, but that just started. Then I didn't know what all that other stuff was, and then they call it the peeling of the onion. You keep, okay, I got this stuff. Oh wait, now I got to work on this. But you keep growing, and it keeps life rich out of you. Thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so the committee's going to leave the room, and you have some refreshments. The refreshments
We have
just for
refreshments.
after? They can have
Don't
them
they
now.
get bacon snack now?
Yeah, so we'll be back in 10 or 15 minutes, so we'll have a little break, okay?
Yeah.
So this isn't exactly like the Academy Awards where you don't know what's going to happen. But there is a little element, because I think it's a ritual of initiation, so there's a little element of suspense. The committee met and is happy to approve the dissertation of Steve Dallman. We've simply asked that you add a short section at the end of the dissertation on the clinical implications, kind of in the light of the discussion that we had today. Outside of that, we are extremely happy with this beautiful piece of work. So congratulations, Doctor.
Some refreshments.
Okay, and there's a little.
But mostly, again, I want to thank the
Yeah.
committee for all the wonderful work they did from the time I walked into this place. Brendan was my advisor. Amanda's worked with me for a long time and was so helpful in this process. And Danielle, he basically helped me put this together. Without his knowledge and nurturing, especially through the methodology process, I don't know how it would have come together. So thank you so much. And that this group of characters, I mean, how could you get them all in a room anyway? So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yay.